Welcome to Huddle Up with Matias Bueno. Today's guest is a host, writer for Sportsnet, as well as host of the Waggle podcast for the CFL, Donnovan Bennett. Donnovan, thanks for joining me on today's episode. I'm really excited to talk ball with you, especially after the exciting week that was with Grey Cup 108 festivities.
Yeah, well, my pleasure. Happy to be here.
The Grey Cup was a classic for the ages, being the fourth overtime game in the championship's history and the third since 2005. Winnipeg and Hamilton met in 2019 in Calgary, where Winnipeg trounced them by 3 scores, but this one was a lot different. And Hamilton had a much stronger team. Winnipeg were able to retain many of the core players that were a part of the roster that won in 2019. And it was just an amazing game throughout. What were some of the things that you saw that allowed for Winnipeg to come away with the win from your perspective?
I mean, the CFL All-Stars came out today, and Winnipeg had 11 of them. So there's that, right? They lapped the field. There's just so much depth on that team in terms of high-level players. The next closest team was Hamilton with 4. So I think that. And the other thing I would say is, Zach Collaros, right? He's been super clutch, and I think people forgot that before he was injured, he was in the conversation for best player in the league with a Bo Levi Mitchell, a Mike Riley. The only reason why he wasn't in that conversation is because he couldn't stay on the field. But once he's been able to have, some injury luck, he's been dynamite. This was his first Grey Cup in his 3 appearances where he's thrown an interception. And yeah, he started poorly. The first 3 quarters, it was 12 of 19 for 120 yards, 2 INTs, and a 41.7 QB rating. But in the fourth quarter in OT, it was lights out, 9 of 13, 119 yards, 2 TDs, 137.5 QB rating. And that gave him, his 17th career game-winning drive in, fourth quarter or overtime. And so 17, that's a full season worth of game-winning drives that he's had in his career, and he's still going. So it just capped off what was a banner year for him. MOP earlier in the week, Grey Cup MVP, and obviously a Grey Cup champ. And so this, to me, was the year of Zach Collaros for sure.
Collaros being the first Bomber player to win the Most Outstanding Player Award since 2002, with Milt Stegall having won it. It's incredible to think how long of a time Bombers fans had to wait to see that trophy come to Winnipeg, and as well for them to win the Grey Cup in the same year, because similar to other sports where a player wins an MVP, it's not always the case that the team also wins the championship. And we see it sometimes in the NFL with Matt Ryan having won the MVP the year the Falcons blew the 28-3 lead in the Super Bowl, and Tom Brady having won MVP in a few years that he wasn't a Super Bowl champion. Do you think it's a little bit tougher sometimes with teams that have great expectations to win it all, having won many individual awards, and then having to replicate that in the Grey Cup? Or do you think it's easy for players to tune out the accolades that they accrue before playing in the big game?
Yeah, well, we've seen it in the NCAA where, someone wins the Heisman and is in the championship game, and there's all that expectation. And then, the opposite team ends up winning, and the best player on that team, that team goes out and plays hard for them. We saw that with, best example being Vince Young going up against USC, and USC had Heisman winner Reggie Bush and Heisman winner, Matt Leinart, and it was almost like they were trying to prove that the Texas team that Vince Young, was the best player in college at the time. And I think to a certain respect, and you had it, across the board, right? Is Adam Big Hill the best defensive player in the league, or is it Simone Lawrence? Zach Collaros deserving of being MOP. And so that team who doesn't get the accolades, who only has quote unquote 4 All-Stars, not the 11 that Winnipeg has, they almost have that extra motivation or chip on the shoulder. I think Winnipeg is just so clearly the best team in the league. They have been now for multiple years, that ultimately it didn't matter. They were on the road in a hostile environment, bad start, and they were still able to overcome. But yeah, certainly from a narrative perspective, media types like me are asking the annoying questions to the team that's facing someone like an MOP, saying, what are you going to do to stop them and whatnot? And people get sick of hearing that, and so they go out on Sunday and try to prove a point.
And as you mentioned, Hamilton Tiger Cats being the hosts, Tim Hortons Field is a hostile environment for away teams to play at, especially considering it was the Grey Cup. And if I'm not mistaken, it was the first time that the Grey Cup had been hosted in Hamilton since the Snow Bowl in 96, when the Toronto Argonauts won their first of back-to-back Grey Cups against the Edmonton Eskimos. And that game as well provided diverse weather conditions for teams to have to face. But at the same time, while there wasn't snow on this weekend, the wind was a huge factor. And some fans were surprised to see Mike O'Shea elect to kick off in the second half. But as we saw at the end of the game, it aged extremely well for Coach O'Shea to decide to take the win in the fourth quarter, because it's huge. And for yourself, having played university football for Western, you know, when you play for a great program and there's great expectations and you're playing in tough environments or the season's on the line, the weather is going to be something that is huge to play into your advantage if you have the opportunity to take it.
Yeah, no question. I mean, we saw a record wind in the day before, so you knew that wind, although not at that level, was going to be a factor on Grey Cup Sunday. And it is a bit of a luxury to be able to do that. One, you have to be confident that it's still going to be a close game in the fourth quarter and that the wind is still going to matter. A couple weeks ago, the Queens Gales elected to do the same thing to make sure that they had the wind in the fourth quarter when they were facing the Western Mustangs in the Yates Cup. Well, the game was over by the time we got to the fourth quarter. So maybe that extra possession, starting with the ball, would have been more valuable. So you need to know that the game's going to be close. And the other is, you need to know that you have a great defense, and you trust that your defense, not once but twice at the beginning of halves, it's going to be able to get a stop and get a 3 and out. And Hamilton not only started the game with a 2 and out, they started the first 2 series with 2 and outs. So when you know that you've got a great defense, and this Winnipeg Blue Bombers defense is historically great, it makes you a little bit more confident to make a decision like that and take the win in the fourth. But the amount of kicking that happens in the CFL game, the wind is even more a factor than it is in the NFL or in American football more broadly. And the amount of passing that happens in the CFL game, specifically passing with a wide field, that wide out throw where the ball is in the air for a long time. The wind plays much more of a factor in the CFL game than it does in the NFL. Naturally, when you have an extra down, you're more apt to run the ball. And the wind doesn't play a factor at all when you're running. It's all about when the ball's in the air via the pass or the kick. And so that's why I think what O'Shea did was somewhat antithetical, but made tons of logical sense and ended up working out well.
And as you mentioned, the kicking game is very important. And down the stretch in the fourth quarter, a decision was made somewhere along the line that gave Hamilton a little bit of a bigger task to win the game, as they conceded a single on the final kickoff after Winnipeg's touchdown, after Winnipeg had kicked a field goal to go ahead. Hamilton's Tim White had conceded a single, and people were debating afterwards, was it a coaching decision? Did he make the decision in the moment? Was it the smart idea? Did they want the extra field? Should they not have taken it? What were your thoughts on that play and how it factored into changing the outcome partially? Because had they not have done that, they could have had the chance to chip the field goal in for the win at the end instead of for the tie.
Yeah. So first things first, I disagree with the decision. I am a hoarder of points. I feel like whether it's via the safety or via the rouge, people just give them away cavalierly early in games, or in this case, late in a game, and they all add up. And so it was not just that rouge. After Nick Dembski's touchdown off of the kickoff, there was a rouge there. So there's 2 extra points in the fourth quarter that made a big difference. So there's that portion of it. But I do think, though, that one, it was a coach's decision. I don't think, Poppy White, someone who hasn't played an abundance of Canadian football growing up as an American, would have made that decision on his own. And I know, having been a returner, you want to return everything, right? You have to be told, kicking and screaming, not to bring it out. You always want to bring it out because you always are going to bet on yourself that you're going to have a big returning. And when the game's on the line, you want to go and score. So I think Jeff Reinbold, who's one of the best special teams coaches in the league, told him not to take it out. Now, there's a couple things with that. There's context. You can't just make a blanket statement, I believe, and say, don't take it out. Well, did the ball go over your head? Are you running forward to catch it? Right? All of those things matter. And so the general rule is, if you got to go backwards to get it, well, then maybe take a knee, because your momentum is moving you backwards and you are that much deeper in your end zone than you had planned. But if you are moving forward to get it, or standing still, which was the case of Tim White, then maybe you roll the dice and take it out, because if you look at the freeze frame, there isn't another Blue Bomber in the picture. You may have gotten it to the 35 on your own just by returning it. Now, the calculation is, what's more valuable, having that extra time on the clock in order to sustain a drive, or that extra point? If Hamilton makes a calculation, well, forget about a field goal. We want to go and we want to score a major. We want to score a touchdown. Well, then that one extra point doesn't really matter. And what matters is putting yourself in the best position to do that. And so maybe you value the extra yardage and time not coming off the clock. The other part of the decision matrix for a coach is not only about what might go well, also what might go wrong. What if he fumbles? What if there's a holding penalty that pushes us back anyways, which happens often in returns? Ask Hamilton Tiger Cat fans about that. They lost the Grey Cup in Calgary because of a holding penalty when Brandon Banks returned one for a score. So you're trying to alleviate some of the unknown with the negative variables. And one of the ways you could do that is giving up the point. Again, I personally don't agree with the decision, but I do think that the decision was coached for that to happen. And I do think there is some methodology and logic behind it, even though I don't actually agree with the risk capital in terms of giving up the 1 point.
And that's a brilliant analysis, Donovan. When I was talking about with friends, for someone who played kicker like myself, I was sitting there thinking it has to be a coaching decision. There's no way that a player, especially if they haven't, like you mentioned, having not grown up playing Canadian football, you're forced to make that decision on the fly. And I never honestly thought before about what could go wrong when you bring in the elements of, well, there's a holding penalty, and then you bring it back to 2014, Colaros's first Grey Cup appearance, and Brandon Banks takes it back to the house, but then a sound that will haunt Tiger Cats fans to this day, hearing Andre Proulx say, illegal block in the back, Hamilton number 44, and that's something that cost him a chance to win the game. And I don't think that's a position. Now, mind you, they had more time than they did in 2014 at the end of the game, but definitely not a position that they want to be in if it doesn't give them more time and doesn't give them more field. So it is a tough decision, I guess, for people to maybe debate back and forth, but I would agree with your statement in saying it's not prudent to take the knee, because you could still, worst case scenario, another thing you have to think of is, what if you don't get far enough for a touchdown? Like, you got to be able to kick a field goal for the win. And if you trust your returner to take it out, or at least get 20 yards of free real estate before a holding call, then that's going to be not as bad as if Bombers are right there within 10 yards and you're trying to fight and claw and do a reverse to get out, because that's always a difficult situation too.
Totally. And I look at these scenarios when you're talking about coaching decisions and in-game choices and game management, situational football. I always look at it from this perspective. If I'm the coach, what does my opponent want me to do? What would they prefer happen? And if the scenario I'm choosing is also what they would prefer, that lets me know that's probably not the right choice. And so if you asked anyone on that Blue Bomber sideline, as soon as Poppy White catches the ball, freeze, what do you want? Him to take a knee or bring it out? Literally everyone on that Bomber sideline would say, we would prefer if he takes a knee and we get an extra point. And at the very least, we know if we hold you out of the end zone, we're either winning the Grey Cup or we're going to overtime. So that's why I think ultimately that they made the wrong decision, but not a decision without merit.
Of course. And even down the stretch, when I was watching with my friends, we were initially thinking, oh yeah, 30-yard field goal against the wind. That's not even going to be really easy for him to make if he thinks it's a chip shot with a hurricane in his face. But then when they got down to the 5, and then when Masoli threw the out to Jalen Acklin, I thought that was it. Dietrich Nichols made basically one of the plays of the season, not giving up. And especially as a defender, when you know with 20 yards of real estate in the end zone by 65, and you're only at the 5-yard line. Hamilton is a team historically in this era with this coaching staff that has gone for two to start games, and they're not afraid to go for two often. So I was thinking that they were going to go for it if they didn't make it on second, or B, that they were going to get the touchdown on second anyways.
Yeah, and if they get the touchdown, we're not talking about this, right? We're talking about Hamilton Tiger Cats won it at home, brilliant decision, right? But Jalen Acklin reaches out to meet the ball earlier, or a fingertip doesn't get in there, and he's able to secure the catch, and it's an entirely different conversation, which makes the Canadian game fun because there's so many little idiosyncrasies and wrinkles to the rules that make it fascinating to watch.
With how the game went in overtime, the Bombers, I guess, made the decision to take the win again, but not that Hamilton would have made a different decision. You talk about idiosyncrasies and how Hamilton made the choice to go second. As a coach, do you make the same choice Hamilton does in overtime to take second to win it potentially, or at least match? Or would you have the gusto to say, we want to go first and put the pressure on the away side?
No, I would always want to go second. I think I'm trying to think of a scenario where I've seen anyone in the shootout overtime style choose to go first. You always want the benefit of knowing what you need to do to match, in terms of a field goal will win the game. And so you might be calling plays differently, a touchdown to potentially win or tie if you have to tie, or if you have to secure the 2-point convert or not, or whether or not you can just win it outright with a touchdown or a field goal. So I think you always want to know what you have to do to win, and thus you'd always want to go second.
Interesting. I guess maybe from watching other sports, when it comes to, for example, a penalty shootout in soccer, you'd think that when you choose to go first, if you score, which you're more likely to, then it puts pressure on the other team. Where I guess in football, you're right. There's many different factors that come into play with the kinds of decisions you're going to make, depending on what happens first. And if you have to kick a field goal to tie, to win, score a touchdown to win, to tie, or if you have to, again, in the third scenario, score a touchdown and tack on two in order to keep going, which is the case for Hamilton. And I mean, initially I thought the final play touched the ground and kind of held my breath, but it was an amazing play by Winston Rose. He along with Sergio Castillo, two of the hugest signings Winnipeg made, or at least transactions, because Castillo was traded for, that Winnipeg made, I guess more specifically Kyle Walters did, before the trade deadline and before they could not sign any more free agents. And it really helps to have a good GM, and that made a big difference in the end, because Castillo contributed how many points on 15 points on field goals, extra points, rouges. So it really matters in the end, those decisions that you make from a front office perspective.
No question. The interception was crazy because it hits 3 players, doesn't hit the ground somehow. And, I believe, if you watch closely, that it was tipped back up into a teammate in order to secure an interception, that it wasn't just, a mishandled ball or deflection. But Kyle Walters has done an amazing job, one, constructing the roster that I think was good enough to win a championship for a while. They were just held back by the quarterback play and quarterback health, and once they filled that quarterback room with enough depth behind Matt Nichols, and then have figured out that Zach Claros should be the guy leading us into the future and move on from Matt Nichols, the team has just ascended since. But I think the other thing that he did was he got the core of that team in 2019 to come back, not once but twice. To many of them take less money than probably they would have got on the open market or deserved, because of the real tight cap and the fact that everyone was hunting for Winnipeg's players because they were newly crowned champions. The fact that he kept such a huge amount of that team together essentially, and worked with agents and players on finding a number that might not be exciting but would be fair, kudos to him. And it's just a reminder that in a copycat sport, the Winnipeg Blue Bombers won with a Canadian president, Canadian GM, Canadian coach, Canadian tailback, and more broadly, they had the best Canadians out of anyone in the CFL. So to me, the lesson is if you want to win in the CFL, invest in Canadians.
That's an amazing lesson that should be spoken and shouted far and wide across the league. Because if you look at the previous regime that was in Winnipeg, Joe Mack has to have been one of the worst GMs that the Bombers ever had, or that any CFL team has seen in more recent years. There's also ones that could be up there, but at least from the perspective of someone who's been watching Winnipeg, Joe Mack was not a good GM, mainly for the reason that he didn't invest in Canadians. The Bombers probably had the weakest talent of Canadian players in the entire CFL, which is why they went 6-12 and 3-15, and why they couldn't get over the hump. It seemed that when they had to rely on those X factor Canadian players, or Canadian players to step up, as you mentioned, having a starting tailback, receivers, offensive linemen, defensive linemen, it didn't come together. And having Canadians that are really good matters in the CFL. And I know that people have been speculating during Grey Cup week about adding an extra down and the ratio and all these sorts of things. We saw it before, and we'll probably see it again. Canadians being good and playing in the CFL matters. The ratio matters in terms of the strength of the team and the difference between winning and losing and being a champion and not. And especially when it comes to 3 downs versus 4 downs. John Hodge, who I had on a former episode, said it very well. Trying to be better at being the NFL than being the NFL is a recipe that's going to fail 100 times out of 100 if you look at the track record. So for the CFL to try to change the Canadian game just because of like ratings or whatever, like I don't really buy that. But I mean, I'm sure that you may have an opinion on that as well.
Yeah, well, so there's a couple of things. One, there's 2 reasons that I've heard in conversation about why you would add 4 downs. One would be, you got to get the CFL game in front of young kids and get them interested, and they are interested in the NFL, and so that might help. I don't know if I've heard anyone between the ages of 18 to 25 who have said, man, if you gave me 1 more down, I'd be at BMO tomorrow, or I'd be at Tim Hortons Field tomorrow, or BC Place tomorrow. Right? It's not something anyone has really said. And 2, when you look at the fact that scoring is down, and that's somewhat cyclical, but if you added an extra down, would scoring be up? I mean, essentially, I suppose, because there's just another opportunity to get 10 yards and thus stay on the field offensively. But the reason I think scoring is down is because the rosters are very fluid. The contracts have been extremely short. Guys want to bet on themselves for an opportunity to play elsewhere, whether it's in the CFL or in the South. And so you don't have that continuity. You don't have that consistency. And you have great movement among the team's star players, specifically, quarterbacks. That, coupled with the fact that the NFL game has changed to become more offensive, more spread offenses, more throwing the football, that by default, that in relation to the NFL, in explosion of offense, it seems like the CFL isn't as fun or exciting when it was the league for offense. But some of the talented players that we see getting an opportunity in the NFL, Russell Wilson, Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray, 15, 20, 25 years ago, those guys were all playing in the CFL. They couldn't play in the NFL given the pro style offense and given the fact that scouts would just dismiss them because of their size or because of the amount that they ran scramble. Now that is part of the appeal. And so not only do you lose out on those high level players, they're being backfilled by players who are very similar so that the offense stays the same if they get hurt. So, you have Hundley in Baltimore, who's behind Lamar Jackson, Colt McCoy in Arizona behind Kyler Murray. So again, players that theoretically would have been in the CFL are now in the NFL. And so I think those are the reasons why you're seeing scoring down, when you're seeing, the lack of as much offensive explosive plays. And so we could add another down, but that wouldn't get to the root cause of the issue, right? That is just finding a solution for the symptoms and not the actual ailment. And we were spoiled. We came through not long ago a generation where the quarterbacks in the league were Ricky Ray, Henry Burris, Damon Allen, Anthony Calvillo. That's four right there. Not too far ahead of that was Danny McManus. We had an era where half of the league had a Hall of Famer as their starting quarterback. And now I don't think we can say that. And so that's the other piece where who is going to rise and fill some of those shoes? You talk about someone like a Bo Levi Mitchell, a Michael Riley, a Trevor Harris. Those players have had huge investment in terms of people knowing you need to have a great starting quarterback in order to win. But those teams have failed to win with so much investment at that one position around building rosters around them. And thus, those players have struggled to stay healthy because of it. And so it's now a bad investment to the power of two. So I think in terms of roster building, some of the challenges that the CFL game has, just because of, trends and how the culture in the NFL game has changed, and how, at one time, we had some of the best quarterbacks ever playing all at the same time. We were spoiled for a bit, and now we're back to reality.
It's amazing that how many names you could list within one generation of the league that are in the Hall of Fame and are bona fide Hall of Famers, like you mentioned, the Danny McManuses and the Ricky Rays, Calvillos, Henry Burris. Like, those guys were studs and they were unreal. And the fact that they were all in the league at the same time is crazy to me. Or even thinking to the previous generations before that, Joe Theismann being in the CFL and Warren Moon being in the CFL and being a 5-time Grey Cup champion all in a row, and Doug Flutie winning MOP with like 3 different teams and winning Grey Cups with how many different teams and doing all these amazing things. Whereas in the NFL, I mean, people didn't want Warren Moon on their team and stereotyping and not really believing in his abilities. And then look what he did. He is an amazing, amazing tribute to the fact that you can be a great quarterback with that style of play during that generation. And he was really a pioneer at the position and opened doors for guys to be like, hey, it's not just one typical pocket passer. Doug Flutie being short and being disregarded in the NFL. And now Kyler Murray and Russell Wilson are some of the best body prototypes of guys in the NFL at the position. And it's just crazy how the CFL is. I remember having a conversation with Dwayne Ford about this, him talking about how Jeff Garcia playing in the CFL and Doug Flutie and these guys that were like first in the league, and John Huffnagel really implementing a lot of, different styles of play that the NFL started to adopt later, and how people think the CFL is this hand-me-down league, when in reality, like, the CFL has had the pleasure of seeing many great players at quarterback and other positions come through without maybe sometimes as many NFL fans giving the recognition for those guys, which I think is a great testament to how historic the league is with players that were pioneers at different positions and during different generations.
Yeah, and when you look at just above the generation that I referenced, we could just narrow down great players who have become coaches. Kahari Jones, Dave Dickinson, Jason Moss. All of those guys, again, were playing in and around the same time. So you had a wealth of talent in the league at the same time. And so, who from this generation, obviously Zach has put himself in rarefied air. Bo Levi Mitchell has done some great things. But what makes that previous generation special is those guys all played at a high level until their late 30s or sometimes, 40s. And so Will, Bo, and Michael Riley, and Trevor Harris, and Zach Claros, and eventually, because he's got much more time, but Cody Fajardo. Will those guys be able to play at that high a level for as long? That's the real question. Because if they bow out of the game earlier, then you start back on that treadmill of getting another quarterback up to speed to play at that level.
That's a great point, and we'll definitely have to wait and see how things will unfold as time goes on, and hoping that maybe contracts can get longer, that you can see stability build with teams to ensure that the turnover doesn't create, maybe it would be lower scoring, or just, it can be difficult when you're having to change teams often, especially when the money doesn't allow you to own a house in 3 places and you can just transit back and forth. It's no problem. And people want routine and they want a foundation. You look at someone like Adam Bighill, who took a huge pay cut and it paid off. He's a back-to-back Grey Cup champion and one of the most outstanding defensive player. And he probably could have been paid more in another team. And that's just speaks to the commitment of players like him to wanting that continuity in winning championships.
No question. No question. Yeah. It'll be a fun storyline to continue to watch and observe if you're a CFL fan.
So Donnovan, we are getting towards the end of our time. So I wanted to ask you 3 wrap-up questions to have a little bit more fun before we go for today.
Sure. Let's do it.
Who is the best coach in U Sports during the time that you played for Western?
Wow, the best coach in U Sports. I mean, I'm biased, and so I would say Larry Haler, my head coach. You know, when we finished there, the all-time winningest coach in U Sports history. But I think, quite frankly, the best coach ever, or the most influential coach ever, would be Greg Marshall, who was coaching at McMaster while I was there, then went to the CFL, coached the Tiger Cats, and then eventually, you know, my last year at Western came and was the coach in waiting at Western, was our offensive coordinator the first year, and then took over as head coach after Larry Haler moved on. And, you know, he has now won 2 Vanier Cups at Western as a head coach. He's won more Yates Cups as a coach than most programs have, period. He has alone. Not to mention the fact that he's won Yates and Vanier Cups as a player. He's won the Heck Crichton Trophy as a player. I mean, he's the all-time winner when it comes to the amateur football in Canada. He is our version of Nick Saban. He's Nick Saban with a cottage and free healthcare. He is, you know, that dude for us. And so nobody has been able to win more consistently in different eras, right? So, you know, when you talk about him being obviously a player, then an assistant coach, and, you know, at Western and winning there, and then becoming the head coach at McMaster and winning there, and then now certainly, you know, doing it for Western. So, you know, different eras, different styles, different levels, but he's built up, you know, multiple programs. Stepatasic has taken what Greg Marshall did and ran with it at McMaster, but you know, McMaster was the laughingstock when it came to football. He built, in many ways, the football program, but also in and around it, that athletics department, which is now a powerhouse, was built up around the success of that football program. So, you know, kudos to him, and you're seeing the fruits of it in terms of his coaching tree. You know, Mike Folds is a product of his coaching tree. You know, there's descendants of him on staffs in Windsor, in Waterloo, in Queens, and obviously with Folds and Laurier. So, you know, he has a lasting impact, certainly on the game. So I would say, you know, Haler is certainly the GOAT, but the baby goat would be, you know, someone on Haler's coaching tree, Greg Marshall, who is quickly adding to his resume of being the most, you know, influential person in U Sports history.
Who's the greatest CFL quarterback of all time, at least in the modern era, as in 1958 to present?
Yeah, I would say that the most dominant player in CFL history is Doug Flutie. Doug Flutie, no matter where he was, dragged his teams to Grey Cup contention, but also, you know, made it a show, made it fun to watch. He was essentially, for those who weren't around, he was the Steph Curry of the CFL. He won at a high level with team success, had great individual success, but also brought a flair to the game where it was appointment viewing. So I think full stop, the greatest player in CFL history was Doug Flutie. He didn't have the longevity necessarily because he went and played in the NFL and because it took him a while to get on the field to start his career. But once he was on the field, he was on a different level than anybody else.
My final question for you I have, Donovan, is who was the player that you looked up to the most when you were a kid that inspired you when you played football?
That's a great question. I mean, yeah, so as a former running back, I looked up to a bunch of players in terms of their style of play and implementing that into my game, especially as an undersized running back. So the first one would be Emmitt Smith. I had the pleasure of meeting him, all-time leading rusher in NFL history, and he was the back that I followed because he was tough. Really, he was the first guy to really bounce it outside when there was nothing there. Great vision, hard runner, and in football, availability is your best ability. And Sunday after Sunday, he was always ready to go. But after him, whether it was Warwick Dunn or Marshall Falk, always gravitated to those smaller backs. Reggie Bush, love to see those guys be explosive and added to the game. And from a CFL context, in terms of inspiring, not just by the type of play and the level of play, but the person that they were, it would be Michael Pinball Clemens. In high school, I wore 31 in homage to him. I've never seen him not smile. I've never heard someone say a bad word about him. And so in many cases, not just in a football context, but in a life context, I've asked myself, WWPD, what would Pinball do? And, basically, if you can use that as a compass, that'll probably have you in good stead to make positive decisions more often than not. So he would be someone who has, been an inspiration as a player, and now with his philanthropy and his stewardship of the Argos continues to be an inspiration.
Those are great answers, especially considering that all of them are well deserved to be in the Hall of Fame and were just great people overall. Many positive contributions on the field and off the field. And Pinball Clemens, he is a top class character in the CFL, in every CFL circle that he was a part of as a player, as a coach, as a part of the front office with the Argos. He is the real deal. And like you said, and it makes me smile when you say never seen him not smile. He has such a contagious, positive personality, and he's definitely a great player to look up to.
Awesome. I'm glad you feel the same.
And with that, Donovan, I want to thank you for having been on today's episode. It was a great pleasure to chat about the CFL with you, review the Grey Cup, the ins and outs of the decisions that a coach will have to make during a highly contested game like that, and also to talk a bit about your time as a youth sports player with the Western Mustangs, and to learn more about the GOAT and Baby Go in youth sports football. So Donovan, with that, I want to thank you. It was a great pleasure, man.
Thank you for having me. Always love talking about football, so I appreciate it.
And thank you to the listener for enjoying today's episode with Sportsnet writer, host, and host of the Waggle CFL podcast, Donnovan Bennett.